I think sustainability is nice because people can relate to it. It's enough in the cultural zeitgeist that people are like, okay, I get it. We actually have the creative capabilities. We now have the technologies. We have the communication infrastructure to regenerate, to generate more, to bring about greater health in our ecosystems, our healthcare systems, our education systems, our trade systems that moves us towards at least something that has increased wholeness from what we've inherited.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told, and today I invite you to join me in conversation with Abrah Dresdale as we take a communication perspective on regenerative design and social permaculture. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. Whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being for all of us. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Abrah. Abrah is a social designer, and we will hear more about what that means in this conversation. She consults through the national organization she co-founded called Regenerate Change. She serves as faculty at UMass Amherst and the Omega Institute, and is the author of Regenerative Design for Changemakers, a social permaculture guide. I'm so glad to be able to include this conversation in our sustainability series. When I first pitched this conversation to Abrah, she made it very clear that for her, sustainability actually wasn't at the heart of it. It was something else, and that is regeneration. Graciously, she's still letting me include our conversation in the sustainability series, but I do offer this intentionally as the last conversation so it can act as a jumping off point. We've been exploring sustainability, but now the question becomes, how do we go beyond that? Which is truthfully not something I was asking until I met Abrah. And it's what she's going to help us figure out today. There's definitely going to be some new language in today's conversation. It was new for me, so I imagine it might be for you as well. Still, I invite you to lean in with me and learn something new. And beyond that, I think what Abrah offers us in this conversation that is especially meaningful is not just a new thing to know, but a new way of being and a new perspective, one that I am very excited to adopt. So let's wrap up this series with Abrah. Hi, Abrah. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. I've really been looking forward to it.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, Abbie. I have been as well.
I think we have a lot of shared ground to cover, or maybe some ideas that run parallel to each other that we can hopefully build on in this conversation. And maybe each teach each other a little something, learn something new along with the audience today. So before I get ahead of myself, though, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. My name is Abrah Dresdale, and I use she and her pronouns. I currently live in occupied Pecumtuck territory in what is known as Western Mass, Greenfield. And I'm a social designer and visionary educator, ritual artist, author, and mama of a 2-year-old.
Sweet. That is a great place to start. What does it mean, right off the bat, I'll ask for clarification, what does it mean to be a social designer?
Yeah, so let's see. I think I've always been drawn to practices and movements that do things either consciously or intentionally, yoking personal agency and collective imagination and power towards envisioning the worlds, whether they're micro worlds to macro society level worlds of what we want to see and call in for what's possible. And I didn't quite realize that I was looking for a systematic way to design, to shape, to craft social worlds. But my different professional studies and personal passions have led me towards gaining my master's degree in ecological design and planning, and then applying that same tool set to the landscapes that are social. So that can be designing one's own life and wellness and work-life balance, for instance, to designing organizational systems and strategic plans or community actions and endeavors, all the way up to thinking about how can we work in networks and coalitions and alliances towards designing greater social change in our infrastructure, in our policies, in the ways that we enact change in, say, the food system or the carceral system, et cetera. So social design to me is really taking a rigorous and systematic design approach that's rooted in whole systems thinking, in observation and, ecological intelligence, grafted with social justice praxis, and applying it towards the end of social design and social change.
Yeah, that systems thinking that's a new concept to me, one that I've been digging into recently because of a couple different projects I'm working on.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes so much sense to me. I think that matters so much. And I'd put it up there with, a kind of intersectionality approach that I see people use being very important, that you have to kind of zoom out and look at the big picture and see the system, see that things are interrelated. I think I just see it as such a disservice to ourselves if we're too hyper-focused on one thing without looking at the relationships part of it, the context part of it, and saying, yeah, we don't exist in a bubble. We exist in these relationships, in these social worlds, in these cultures, on a planet as part of an ecosystem, whether we see ourselves as part of an ecosystem or not, we are a part of this interlocking system. And so to zoom out, there is a lot of value to be gained in using that perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am actually writing our newsletter that will be out in the new moon this coming month at Regenerate Change, which is the organization I co-founded in 2017. And this newsletter, we're looking at fragmentation as the root cause of so many of the deleterious effects we see on the planet today. And I think the siloing and compartmentalization, the sort of atomization worldview that is so propagated in the Western education system and Western science. It just really ripples and creates that type of myopic understanding and inquiry, rather than zooming out and having, if you will, more of an ecological frame that is really looking at wholeness and interrelationship. And I think that's something that regenerative design in particular does well. It looks at the study of relationships and how do we create systems change when we work with the dynamics that are occurring in a small to large social ecosystem, natural ecosystem. I don't even like creating a binary between those, but I think it's helpful to note that there are ecosystems that we are inherently part of as human apes. And then how do we design those? Just in the same way we might design a farm ecosystem or a forested landscape for increased health and resilience, for instance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love the focus on design and the intentionality piece that you're talking about, because truthfully, there was a little bit of learning for me as well, coming in contact with your work as you talk about design. And I have heard that talked about as well, like I've talked about in the spaces that I'm using systems thinking. And, my brain can't help but when I hear design, I think about interior design or, that kind of world. And so it's new to open myself up to think about, well, how is our society designed? How are our relationships designed? How are organizations designed? And that tracks back to the lens, the perspective that I use, this communication perspective that says you do have a choice and you have kind of this personal power to affect change in your social world. And it's about being intentional in it. And so when you do that zooming out, when you do that looking at the context, when you take the time to sit in reflection, think about the patterns that you've contributed to and ask, how did this get made? How did we get where we are today? That's when you can start to see the systems and the structures that are in place. And, the language I also use is those stories that exist as well. What are the stories that are in place that have shaped the way that we've lived and the way that we've acted and the way that we've been in relationship with each other? And then do we like those stories? And do we want to keep those stories? Would we rather be telling a new story? So that's such a big frame for me. In a lot of my conversations and a lot of the work that I see people doing is that, what's the old story And what's the new story you're trying to tell with your work? So I wonder if you have language for that. Like, what would you say is the new story that you hope to tell people by bringing out all these ideas about regeneration in every area of our lives?
Well, it's funny, Abbie, I get asked a lot, like, well, what is your vision? And I don't think you're actually asking that. And to the vision question, I say, I don't have one. I don't think it's up to one person. I think we need to collectively ideate and, very a la Adrienne Maree Brown, like emergent strategy. We can't actually have a fixed vision because we need to adapt to all sorts of chaos and ever-changing, exciting emergences. But I think what you're maybe asking about is what's the seed of possibility and the message in that for people who aspire to be social designers, and what is the new story we can tell? And I think, I want to start by saying that I truly, truly believe that every single one of us is intrinsically born with the capability to design. That is just one of the many human intelligences that we possess. And I think we're designing all the time, mostly implicitly or unconsciously, as you actually just spoke to in our communication styles, et cetera. And so I think my message to the world is, how can we use design and futurism, visionary futurism, as frameworks to explicitly call in the type of relationships and lives and livelihoods and transformation that is possible, that we are not passive recipients who are disempowered, even though that is what every single thing in the overculture, a term by Clarissa Pinkola Estes, wants us to believe. The overculture says you should be paralyzed, you are puny, you cannot make a difference. And I really believe that we can wield power and we can do it across scales. And the design process is one of the many, many tools. And I added futurism because I truly believe if we use our communication skills, whether it's written or spoken, artistic, et cetera, we can paint pictures in the imaginations of ourselves and others of what is possible beyond the limitations of what we've received as the status quo. And the more we can engage in practices of futurism, and particularly doing them together, especially across social identity differences, the more we can envision and take steps towards crafting a world that will serve all. So I think that is my big vision and message, that we understand as a people that we are far more creative and powerful than we are told we are. And there's so many frameworks out there to support us in designing the delivery systems for our gifts and our collective movements for change.
Yes, I'm so glad that you contextualize that by making the distinction between the vision and the story, because yes, I'm not really asking what the vision and saying what is the story in terms of what do you want to tell people is true and real and possible. And that makes me think that, the kind of language that we'd use in the CMM theory or in a communication perspective is that what we're working towards is better social worlds. And that those are made through our communication. Define better social worlds however you want. There's going to be a million different definitions for that. But that's a question and language that I bring up a lot in my conversations. And I'm forgetting which conversation it was now. I've had so many. But there was one conversation where I kind of asked, what's your idea of a better social world? And this person pointed out that kind of makes it sound like, well, way down the line, what do you wish was possible then? But the direction of our conversation ended up going in terms of what if the better social world, quote unquote, is right now? What can be better right now? It doesn't have to be this distant, gee, I hope one day we get there. What am I doing as a participant in the social world? Because I am, as someone who has choice, as someone who can make their own meaning. How do I create this better social world that exists right now? And I'm thinking of like imagination and curiosity and inquiry and embodiment being really valuable tools and language that would be a part of this process as well. And making it present right now, not a distant vision for the future that's inflexible or uncertain. But yeah, I like this. What's the better social world? And maybe that is, not present in the moment. Maybe it doesn't feel realistic. Maybe you have a big vision for the social world, but that can still inform your present and what choices you make. Kind of like, okay, if I believed that was possible, how would I act to make it so, kind of thing.
Yeah, I bring in Goethe's poem, I Am the Decisive Element, into my book, Regenerative Design for Changemakers, and really love that as a tenet for the call to action for changemakers, understanding that each of us inherently are changemakers if we see ourselves that way. And then we can learn or remember to ourselves our inherent capabilities of designing and enacting that change.
Yeah, when you first introduce yourself to say, I'm a social designer, I'm almost picturing like capital S, capital D, social designer. But that's a good remembering too of like, you don't have to have a degree to be that. You don't have to be in any kind of certain profession. Each of us are filling this social design role, whether we recognize it or not. But maybe that's something you could speak to more to that language. Maybe talk to us about what you mean when you talk about change makers. Who are change makers, and what does it look like to be a change maker?
Yeah, I think that's another one that can feel exclusive, or like, are you an artist? And I'm just really interested in breaking down all of these artificial fences, like this siloization that, you're one or you're three, or you have to have a degree. And it's like, we are so beyond the understanding of our intelligences. And so same thing. I believe that everyone is a change maker. And our theory of change at Regenerate Change, largely informed by one of my mentors, Carol Sanford, who's an author and entrepreneur in the regenerative business world. And it's really looking at nested holes. So if we imagine, say, 3 or 4 concentric rings nested inside of each other, concentric, right? Like the rings of a tree, if you were to cut it and look at it in a side profile, is that at the center ring, really the heartwood, which I write about in my book, it's a botanical term, the heart, the change maker, the individuals at the center. And then the next ring out are all of the groups that we are a member of, whether it's our, civic engagement groups, community groups, religious groups, identity groups, professional affiliations. There are groups that we are a member of, and therefore we actually have influence over. And so we can consciously exert what I call positive contagion by simply the way we conduct ourselves, our beliefs, our communication styles actually ripple out and influence all of those groups that we are a part of in the next ring out. And the more we can be conscientious of our own agency to be disruptors, to question the status quo, to propose change, to build relationships that are alliances in service to change at the group level, we can be a change maker there. We can even exert influence in this theory of change in the next ring out, which is societal systems. All these different groups I named collectively make up, say, the transportation system or the education system. And so how can we work in coalitions and alliances to collectively ripple out and affect change there? And so we actually have our hands in all of these scales of significance. And often I find, most professional change makers are so focused on the external and, making change. I've been one of them. And I do think a lot of the common trends I see, unfortunately, are informed by saviorism and the overlay of missionary colonial culture, with the church saying, oh, you poor X, Y, and Zs, we need to come save you. We need to change the way you're doing your lives. And that lone wolf archetype of like, the savior is going to come in and transform. And it burns out the change maker. It burns bridges often. And it's not really a participatory project that involves the principle of listen, 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 to really understand what is the change that needs to come about, rather than imposing it from some paradigm of do good.
Mhm.
And so often if I'm working with folks who are burnt out, and again, I have been one of them, trying to do good in the world and make change, I often say, let's go back to that heartwood, that center circle. Let's design at the very, smallest scale of the social building blocks, your own life, your own personal practices of wellness and rest. How is your grief? Are you tending it? What are your ancestral patterns like? How are they showing up in your body? Are you able to sleep at night? Are you eating? How's your marriage? How are your friendships? And really start looking at what we call zone 0, 0 in social permaculture, that zone of self. Because if we have cracks in our heartwood, if we have so many shadow spots, et cetera, we are going to necessarily radiate those out into our creations, into the groups we are members of, into all of our valiant efforts at change making. So it's not sequential. I don't believe that we have to first fix ourselves and then we can shine as these incredible agents.
Right.
But simultaneously, and sometimes more importantly, we really need to do that self-reflexive practice and take a look, really hold that mirror up to ourselves and say, how is my own personal health, wellness, and relationships? And how can I design and tend to change inside myself and in my interpersonal sphere, that zone 0, before I start, trying to create all these amazing shifts in the worlds around me. So that is my, medium life answer to your question of who do I see as a change maker?
This whole conversation might just be a vocab lesson, but I think that's okay. I love to hear meaning making and the language are such important parts of it. So I don't think that's, a waste of time. And for me, and I would imagine a lot of people listening to this podcast, some of this language you're using is totally brand new. So I think it's worth it to talk deeper into the meaning. So you just use the language of social permaculture. Can you explain what that is?
Yes. And thank you. You're sort of auditorily sharing parts of my book, because at the end of every chapter is a dedicated social design lexicon.
Yeah.
And throughout there's words in italics. I'm like, most people might not know what this fancy, compound, very niche jargon is. And so we actually, the invitation is for readers to define for themselves at the end of each chapter those words and more. So social permaculture is in the introduction and that social design lexicon. And there's a lot of definitions people like to give, but I'll give the one of permaculture first, and then we'll kind of jump to social. And so permaculture to me is a practice of observing the natural world, understanding its core patterns and processes, regardless of what bioregion you are in, and then applying those principles and those processes to the design of human intervened systems, and doing it in a way that renews or regenerates the health of that ecosystem, but also creates abundance and resource for the human to be in reciprocity with that ecosystem. So Jeff Lawton in Greening of the Desert is sort of a classic example of how do you take a deforested landscape that's been super desertified, and you add soil and compost and plants and water catchment back into the system, and you create an oasis for animals and plant life and humans and food production and, filtering of water and all of the multiple functions that are possible. So I think that's kind of a classic example. And then social permaculture, to me, is really, it is my passion. It feels a little bit like my former passion, or maybe like the foundation of the temple I'm building next. So it's, it's alive for me, and it's in me, but it's also, I feel like my work is evolving beyond social permaculture and regenerative design. So I want to just name that.
Yeah.
But so anyway, what I love about it is taking that same systematic thinking of observation of the context, looking at social and ecological landscapes and how they interact, understanding social identities, location of self, power. We talk about the 4 Ps at Regenerate Change, and actually was developed at Omega Institute, where I taught at the Center for Sustainable Living. And the 4 Ps are power, people, place, and paradigm. And understanding those will give you so much insight. And then how do we apply those ecological patterns to social change and social landscapes using the same systematic design process that we would use in, say, a farm or forested landscape in the realm of physical permaculture. And of course, we can't divorce ourselves from place as social beings. So that's very much in the mix. But I often find in the years and years of work I've done as a consultant that the best laid plans, say for a homestead or a public, college permaculture garden, for instance, will fail because the social infrastructure and the responsibility of the management over the years, the funding, the power privilege dynamics, they have not been thoughtfully designed for, and so the physical system itself will fail. And I saw that so many times, and I said, well, how can I apply my graduate degree in sustainable landscape design and planning towards human social landscape design and planning? My background, my undergraduate, I should say, is in psychology, and I've been deeply interested in education and social systems change my whole life. And so I thought, how can we apply, the physical landscape tools to social landscapes? And lo and behold, there was a nascent field of social permaculture that I was able and fortunate enough to tap into in my late 20s and really be influenced by wonderful thinkers like Pandora Thomas and Starhawk and Lisa DiPiano. And I've now partnered up with Adam Brock, who's my buddy at Regenerate Change, and he wrote Change Here Now in 2017. And simultaneously, we were working out similar ideas about this. And so he was invited on in 2019, and we are rocking out Regenerate Change now. Asia Dorsey has joined us as a co-owner director. It's been exciting to see kind of all the people in this constellation who are doing this work. Jasmine Fuego, I should also name, who I co-founded the organization with in 2017. And to say, like, wow, it's evolving. It's beyond social permaculture now. There's the Emergence Network, and there's social biomimicry, and there's just so many incredible thought leaders and movements that I think are working at a similar problem from different angles. And my hope is that we can continue coordinating more and more so that these different lineages and, intellectual and social emotional approaches can come together to really create, to me, what needs to happen, which is more paradigmatic than pragmatic. And how do we change minds? How do we change cosmologies? How do we change ways of knowing and ontologies so that we can really heal from this disease of fragmentation that I think is just an inherited set of symptoms from the cutting up of the world into geopolitical boundaries and colonization and displacement and cultural amnesia, being cut off from our family's taproots and land and languages and rituals, which is really actually a lot more of where my current work is headed. So, I would say it's the social permaculture applied to the cultural and the intergenerational healing piece. And to me, that's higher up in the watershed than how do we design, our organizations per se.
Yeah. I'm glad that you took that in the direction you did. And even though my question was kind of what's the definition of social permaculture, what I really wish I would have asked or meant to ask was, what does it mean to you? And that's really, I think, the heart of so much of this, because part of what it means to take a communication perspective is to see how we're making meaning in our stories. Like, that is what stories are. Me telling you a story is a version of making meaning of something a story that I lived. And turning into a story that I told. Us where the name of the podcast comes from is this theory within the coordinated management of meaning theory, or this model that's within that theory. And I'm thinking about the way that this conversation is emerging, and that it's reminding me of a conversation I just had that's also part of this series. where I talked to Mark Edwards, who's from Iowa, part of the Department of Natural Resources there for a really long time. And he talks about rewilding efforts.
Mm-hmm.
I was fully prepared to go into that conversation, say, what is rewilding? And for him to give me a really straightforward definition and just have a little education on what rewilding is. And I don't think I got like a good straightforward definition the entire conversation, even though I kept kind of returning to that and trying to pull it out of him, because it was so much more embodied for him and so much more expansive than what the maybe textbook definition of rewilding is to him. It was about fear and exploration and connection and this very personal thing that he's experiencing. And he believes that to be true for everyone else. And he spoke to how he's honestly still learning what it means, even though he's 76 and has been doing this his whole life. So that kind of shook up my expectations. And I'm seeing this conversation having a kind of similar path that, yes, there are textbook definitions for a lot of these terms out there, and we can let people go look those up on their own. But what is interesting and compelling is to hear what it means to you. And to imagine what it might mean to other people too, that feel kind of moved by this language and moved by this perspective. So yeah, that was a lot, but that's kind of where my head's at right now as I'm engaging in this conversation.
Thank you for making that transparent, Abbie.
I love the language part of it so much. And I think that, which is obviously inherent to, communication, but communication is so much more than just what we say, but it is, what is this language? And if you don't have language to talk about something, then you don't talk about it. And so you talking about regeneration does feel really important, because even though, this conversation is going to be part of our sustainability series, you made it clear to me early on that that's not really to you the heart of what you do. And you made this distinction between sustainability and regeneration that was not one I'd thought about. And regeneration was not a word. I mean, I know it as a word, but I was not kind of in it and understanding it in the context of all these other things that I was talking about. So I'm thinking about that because that feels like my own personal experience, even coming into this conversation, that I didn't have the language to talk about anything beyond sustainability. And now I do have that language, and it's exciting to me. So I wonder if you could speak to, again, maybe not the textbook definition, but what it means to you to go beyond sustainability to regeneration.
I think sustainability is nice because people can relate to it. It's enough in the cultural zeitgeist that people are like, okay, I get it, or I get some facet of it. That said, embedded in the very word is the paradigm of sustain. To sustain. Let's sustain what we've got. And what we've got is completely degraded. And who knows what the baseline is, right? The baselines shift over time. But that paradigm was not good enough for me. How do we actually take responsibility for the amount of extraction that our species has done in a very short time? And I will name predominantly our species in the Northern Hemisphere with light skin and white privilege, the owning class, those who own the means of production through the Industrial Revolution, enslavement of West African people onwards, more than West African people, I should say, also in the Americas, and how the money has accumulated in the hands of very few, and the amount of exploitation and degradation that's happened in just the last 400 or 500 years. And let's just sustain where like the levels of carbon in the soil or biodiversity, like to me, that is like just there's blood on my hands. There's blood on the hands of white people like me. And so how can we actually be the true stewards that our ancestors forever, regardless of your racial identity, have been, and truly give back and create abundance and design systems? The classic example I gave about the greening the desert, like we actually have the creative capabilities. We now have the technologies. We have the communication infrastructure to regenerate, to generate more, to bring about greater health in our ecosystems, our healthcare systems, our education systems, our trade systems that moves us towards at least something that has increased wholeness from what we've inherited. And Elisa DiPiano, who's a good friend of mine, who I mentioned earlier, a social permaculturalist. I teach with her at UMass Amherst and taught my first permaculture bunch of courses through Lisa. She says this funny thing, which is if someone asks you, how's your marriage? And you say, it's sustainable. Is that really the aim that we're working
right.
towards?
Not the highest praise.
And I honestly don't think regeneration is the highest thing. I think our understanding of what is possible is going to evolve and evolve and evolve. But for now, like that's sort of like regeneration, solidarity, rematriation, reparation. Like that's the like, how do we restore? And again, what are we restoring to? I don't want to tote a romanticized view of the past, but there is incredible levels to achieve beyond what the current baseline is in 2024. And so regeneration to me is about building a system's capacity to create abundance, nourishment, exchange of resource, be in reciprocity with, connect those systems that are regenerating to other systems that are regenerating. You can use, say, like local economics or local currency as, a concrete example. How do you link entrepreneurship and, say, local food systems with local currency? So you're adding value in the soil, in the commerce and exchange, in the local economy, and you're connecting all these systems to create more abundance and reciprocity. And yeah, I think so much of this comes down to the role of the artist, that I truly believe, just like the designer and the change maker, is that archetype is alive in all of us. And how do we envision, imagine, and enact these kinds of exchanges? And by no means do we have to do it all. We can't. We're one life force. We're finite. We need to rest. We need to have fun and socialize, right? We need to have, just experiences that aren't all about the critical path, I think, to maintain balance. And yet, like, what is your passion? What is your calling? What are those things that spoke to you as a child? Go back and revisit them and follow those threads so that we can be really clear about who and what our contributions are. Like, you seem so clear, Abbie, about your love of language and communication, and look what you've done since you graduated 2 years later. You are doing it, or at least this phase of your life's work. And so to me, I think that is regenerative. How do we take what we inherited and create healing, create wholeness, create abundance, and share it and be in reciprocity?
Regeneration is not a word that I've thought about or known about in the kind of context we're speaking about it in, but there are parts of it that are familiar to me. Like in the CMM theory, we talk about communication as a constitutive force, or alternately something that is generative and has a creative energy to it because it generates this change. So I can draw the connection there in the language you're using. And even though there is, is a part of your regeneration, that, like you're saying, it's not necessarily about going back to a certain time. There's never really maybe been a time in the past that we're like, oh, that was the prime, let's go back to there. There's always been, different issues going on. And so what is something new we can create? So the maybe not necessarily referring to returning to something, but how can we generate something that then keeps generating as in going on and on and on
it's
again.
An iterative process. Exactly.
Right.
The iteration is what's key there.
Yeah. And so when you can start kind of understanding what in my life has this generative creative energy, this generative constitutive force, then you can, really start to participate in that. And I'm thinking, as you're talking to, that I do understand why so many of us would stop at sustainability as the goal. Because if you're in a space of saying, I think the world might end in the closer future than I'd like it to be, let's just go for staying alive. Let's just go for sustaining. But again, that's the issue of not having the language or or kind of addressing the limits of the stories and the kind of social world you're able to imagine for yourself. Because imagining something brand new that's never been done before, that you've never seen before, is a really tall order, I think. And so that's why we need the tools like hear more stories, tell more stories, you know, like share more of this language, all of it. Those are the ingredients to help us be able to grow our imagination, to say, you know, I can actually imagine for ourselves a world, a way of being, a society that is generative. Because right now I think a lot of people are truthfully just stopping at sustainable, which I really appreciate the distinction you make there. And yeah, so maybe it's kind of like first step, work towards sustainability, and then also acknowledge that that's not the end. Because also I think in a lot of people's lives or in a lot of people's practices, maybe the question is still one of sustainability, you know, that you have to be able to sustain before you can regenerate, maybe is how I want to say it. So if you're talking about like your marriage, you know, if that is kind of a comparison, if your marriage is sustainable, well, yes, it would have to be sustainable before you can really, you know, thrive in it or say that it's this really beautiful thing. So maybe it's kind of like a precursor, almost one before the other.
Yeah, I think it's a both and. You know, how I write about it and the diagram in the book is that it is an evolution. Like it's an evolution from sustainability through these different levels towards regeneration. So sustainability is some ways a prerequisite. And there's another part of my mind that says that it's not linear. It's not a progression. And I just wonder, I think our mind likes stepwise processes. And I also think I'm not trying to cancel sustainability. I think there's a role for sustainability. Like I think it probably has a really important function. Like the sustainer archetype is a real archetype. I don't know if you've come across Kim Cran's work. She's an amazing artist, Jungian archetypal person who's created a bunch of card decks, and her archetype decks in particular have deeply touched my journey. And one of these cards is the sustainer, and it's like these beautiful hands. It looks like there's a ball of clay that the sustainer hands are like holding, and that's part of the triptych of the sustainer, the creator, the destroyer, right? So you need the creator, life, you have to sustain life, and then you need the destroyer. If you didn't destroy things, then there would just be so much debris everywhere. And so I think the sustainer archetype actually has a really important function and role, and let's not exile that. And we cannot arrest our thinking at sustainability.
Yeah, no, I am so behind the concept of both and. That's a huge lens in my life, especially because I feel like I grew up with a very much like an either or lens, specifically in terms of like, what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. I was, I think, a child very intent for whatever reason on figuring that out and then doing the right and good things and not doing the bad and wrong things. And growing up has been an experience for me of like, okay, there's a lot more gray in here. And so that's why I do value doing this kind of like reflective work, trying to really pay this close attention and think about the meaning that's being made, because it was so revolutionary for me to, when I came across the theory of CMM, believe that meaning is not innate and it is something that we participate in making. And that felt so empowering to me. And so that's another way I see that our work kind of lining up, that it's, you know, I'll speak for myself and you can tell me if this is wrong or right. I won't put words in your mouth, but I engage with this material for me in a classroom setting only because I was studying interpersonal communication. And it felt so empowering to me that I thought this should not be gatekept in any kind of way. And it should not just be sitting in textbooks for academics to talk about. These are real models and there's real knowledge and language and concepts and tools here that real people in their real lives and real relationships and real communicating could be using. So this idea of better social worlds doesn't just have to stay this theoretical thing. It can be this real goal that we're working towards through real actions. And so I see this kind of like making things accessible as a key core of your work as well, which I think is so important. I
really resonated when I read your kind of about statement of how do we break this down and,
Yeah.
and, not have it in the the walls covered in ivy and
Yes.
really make it, for the layperson or the non-communications specialist. And yeah, I really resonate with the educator archetype of making things accessible and digestible, and the tradition of like popular education culture and folk education and storytelling and oral tradition. And I do teach at UMass Amherst. I have since 2011, and I don't identify as an academic. It does not resonate with me. And I think there's so many ways to communicate. And so I'm really excited for you that you put this platform of a podcast together to share with the world all these exciting ideas.
Yeah, a lot of people in the CMM community, like the title of like scholar practitioner. And I like, scholar maybe does feel a little inaccessible, but I like that distinction because I am so cute. I love the heady theory language part of it and the models and the whatever. And that resonates with me. And also I want to put it to practice and make it tangible and make it real for people.
Yeah.
I want to touch on another part of your work, and I'd be curious to hear how all of this interacts for you and how it all relates. But I know you work with prison food justice. Is that kind of the language you would use? I think that's the language. Okay. Yeah. So this work that you do with prison food justice, I'm curious about. I could imagine that being something that feels regenerative in a certain way. I'm curious about how that relates to your other work and why that matters. Okay, I'm asking a lot of questions. Let me start with how did you first come to do this work?
Well, like you just said, scholar practitioner, I really believe in praxis and that on the ground applying these ideas and frameworks really needs a laboratory so that the on the ground feedback system informs the writing, the book, the newsletters, all the communications, how we work with clients. And there's just like an incredible feedback loop there. And so I think I'm feeling a little heartbroken right now because I'm not actively doing that work. It really got, the pandemic really shut down a lot of incredible efforts that were moving forward. And I will say just a block away from where I'm sitting is the Franklin County House of Corrections, where I worked for 7 years. And they still have a full-time garden coordinator, nutrition educator person, and other kind of faculty through the community college still come in and teach there. So it's active. There's it's called Farms for Families, which is kind of the last big project where people who are on the inside are growing food by choice for their family members who, when they come for visits, get a CSA box. And so that people on the inside are still providing for their families on the outside, often who are food insecure. I right after graduate school was hired to create an associate's program at the community college here in town in Greenfield. And I created this amazing program and taught there for 4.5 years. And at that time was asked through a grant initiative to migrate 1 or 2 of the courses into the jail and help them establish a garden. And that was a big success. And then we just built and built and built on that. And so after I resigned from the college, I continued to consult for and teach at the jail. And we built out what has become now a nationally recognized program that's called the Jail to Farm to College and Employment Program. Bit of a mouthful, but you get the gist of what happens there.
I get a good picture.
And it's just been a really incredible source of positivity and light in the community. CNN did a piece on it. It's been picked up, and I use the momentum of that work as part of one of the co-founders of the Northeast Prison Food Justice Movement. I helped start the Prison Garden Prison Garden Educators Collaborative in the Northeast, and consulted for Farm to Institution New England on helping them create a whole new sector. So they do farm to school, farm to hospital, and now in the last 5 years, they've put attention on farm to corrections, which is so exciting. My background is in food systems planning. I can't think of a higher public health crisis than food service and diabetes and malnutrition in our carceral system for our incarcerated residents. And it was such a joy to work with people and like reconnecting with their historical foodways and creating, meal plans from the food that they're growing in the gardens. And simultaneously they're getting college credit for free that they can transfer. So it was really about using this incredibly oppressive system's internal resources channeled through the education department to support the incarcerated people, often the ones most impacted by classism and racism in this country, and using those resources to support them in building more sovereignty and more agency and more power, as well as job training and college credit and pro-social, all the things that look good on grant paper. But ultimately, it wasn't about the gardens. It wasn't about the cooking classes. It was about sovereignty. And so, yeah, it's unfortunately, I'm not doing that work anymore, but I may again in the future. And, one thing we haven't touched on, Abbie, but I just want to name my Jewish heritage really informs my ethos to the world. So tikkun olam, it's a term, maybe you've heard it. Others have heard it. It literally means the mending of the world. And Pirkei Avot, which is a Jewish book of ethics, says it's not upon us to heal the whole world, but we must begin. We must start somewhere. And to me, that work in particular was where I offered a lot of tikkun, a lot of mending and healing. I think right now, for me personally, since having my kiddo, there's a lot that I'm working on in my family of origin, trauma stories that I'm understanding about the way that families are so oppressed and disenfranchised in the US. It's horrific, which of course I knew intellectually, but I'm a little experience of it.
Yeah.
And someone with like so much social privilege and creativity, and I know I advocate for myself, and yet it's like, there's no safety net. There's no like built-in kinship circles. It's atrocious. And so I think that's where I'm doing my tikkun work right now is deeply in my family system. I'm still working, part-time with my organization, but I think what has inspired me and where my work is going next is really thinking about the role of our cultural taproots and how we've been severed and how to support Jews, non-Jews, people who are like, hey, there's cultural amnesia happening. I am starving for meaning, and everywhere I look is devoid, whether it's consumerism or doing this Buddhist workshop or going to the next ayahuasca ceremony. And I come back still feeling empty and confused about who I am, who are my people, what are my customs, where do I belong, what are my spiritual practices that tether me to this earth in such a crazy, chaotic time. And so I'm really interested in supporting individuals in reclamation of ritual, of ancestral research. I'm now a facilitator, very, very nascently, of family constellations, which is a healing modality for untangling ancestral knots. And how can we really work on the level of grief and fragmentation in our own lineages to constitute more wholeness so that we can come full to conversations across difference, to conversations of visioning the future we want without being that fragmented heartwood, right? With all of our cracks at the center that often cause us to want to grasp at other people's wholeness or cultures and idealize it and appropriate it, and just recapitulating more cycles of harm of the original colonial, mission. So that's I think where I'm shifting what kind of was my prison food justice niche for the 7 years before the pandemic, that I'm very pleased about the legacy that I've left in that work. And I still pick up on it with some of our consulting clients at Regenerate Change, but I feel like my body of work is moving more in the kind of archetypal and ancestral realm to support what's happening on Earth here and now.
I imagine that there could be people listening be like, how are we talking about Judaism and prison food justice and ancestral amnesia, all of these things in a conversation that's supposed to be about like sustainability or regeneration, the environment, like how do we end up here? But to me, I'm like, how could we not end up here? Like we, to kind of bring us full circle, it's all so interconnected. Mm-hmm. And you talking about the way that Judaism shapes your perspective in the world makes me think of a model that's a part of the CMM theory that's called the hierarchy model. I don't have any power to actually change anything, but I prefer to think of it as the heterarchy model, referencing that, there's movability and flexibility within the hierarchy. And it references a hierarchy of context, layers of context that shape us to say, context is important to pay attention to. It shapes us, but it's not this one amorphous blob floating above or around us. There are distinct layers there because you have the unique context of the way you see yourself, the relationships you're in, the larger society you're a part of, the culture that you come from, and that influences the way you think, the world at large. And so being able to break down your context into contexts, plural, is valuable because it helps answer that question of motivation, I would say. And using the framework that CMM offers around choice and meaning making, that's why I prefer the heterarchy, because then you can recognize what's your highest level context. That's the language we would use. And then you could make a choice if you'd like that to be a different context. And so one of the ways that I see change being really possible, especially when it comes to climate change, our relationship to the planet, our practices around sustainability or regeneration, wherever you're at with that, however you want to think about it, is to think about what are we motivated by? And if I was motivated by something different, would I maybe act differently? So I think, like, for example, to talk about what you're saying, if you can say my highest level of context right now, my biggest motivation is this idea of healing and doing this healing work. How would I act if that was truly the highest level context? That was truly the biggest motivator. If my biggest motivator was working toward regeneration instead of just sustainability, how would that shape how I act and the choices I made and the stories I told and the ways I showed up in my relationships? It feels like aligned with what you're talking about in almost that, okay, there's this surface level version of what's going on, or there's this very visible, I don't want to say surface level, but there's this very visible aspect of what's going on, or the part that is most talked about. We're not at a shortage of talking about what's going on in our organizations. It feels like everybody's a consultant these days. The organizations, they want to know how to interact, whatever. And then you're saying, okay, that's the really visible part, and that's addressed to death. We kind of got that covered. What about this invisible part?
Yep.
So to speak, invisible in the culture, at least, that you and I can both speak to, of what's going on inside yourself, and where do you come from? And how does that shape you? And what are the practices that you have? And how are you feeling about things? And how are you experiencing the world? What meaning are you making? And saying that both of these things are happening at once and they both matter.
And I'll just, to your last point there, Abbie, of like the visible and the external mishigas, the mess that we're in, and then kind of like the invisible or the roots of it. And how do you reconcile, and how do we get here in this conversation? Listeners might be thinking, and literally my book that came out in 2021, the entire first half is what we've just been talking about.
Yeah.
It's about the self as a blueprint for systemic change. Yeah. And chapter 1 starts us like location of self, making ancestral altars, mapping social identities. What are our beliefs, our values, our ancestral lineages? In chapter 5, all about grief. How do we honor our grief? Where have we done bypasses? What are the rituals? So the first 7 chapters, the first whole section is all about the self and all about this and the theory of that heartwood, right? And how we radiate out. And it flows, I think, quite beautifully into the second half, the second section, another 7 chapters that are all about rigorous social design. And you bring a change-making project to the social design lab, and you take it through exercise by exercise after or simultaneous to you've done the self-inquiry work and understanding who you are as an agent of change, that building block, if you will, that nested hole from the first half of the book. So they actually go side by side. Yeah. And so I'm saying in 2024, I'm interested in actually drilling into chapter 1 and chapter 5 of the book I wrote the January Trump was inaugurated. These things are very, very interconnected. And I think you're right. There's often this sort of mild obsessive nature about, well, how do we redesign the external systems? And we're so taught in this culture and the Western overculture to focus on the materiality instead of what there's a collective called Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures, and they talk about a depth education instead of a breadth and a mastery-based education. The depth education looks at all of these layers of context that you just enumerated, and this is the onion as the metaphor. And how do we whoa, what is in here? And how do we start unpeeling this to really remember who we are before our ancestors either were enslaved, exiled, and or, seeking religious or financial freedom from persecution? That is a vast majority of who our people were and why they moved all over this planet. And who were we when we used to be connected to land, when our connection to place was sustainable, when we were in reciprocity with place? And what has happened? You asked the question in our emails about the intersection of land and justice, and we just absolutely cannot talk about one without the other.
Yeah.
Without land, we do not have sovereignty and defensibility and local energy and food and water. And without addressing issues of justice, we can't attend to the land because we're living in a toxic throwaway culture that throws people away, puts Superfund sites in poor Black and brown neighborhood. We have to talk about these things simultaneously. So, for me, understanding the self and the psychology in some ways, if you want to put it into psychology, although I'm obviously interested in way more than a Western approach.
Yes. Yeah.
To me, it connects directly with change making and who and how and in what capacities are we aiming for change? What happens if we're missing the big target? We're spending all of our decades of life force pointed towards a North Star, and that North Star looks exactly like German or Dutch or British colonization, and we define ourselves as the most liberal progressive people. We really need to super examine, I think, at the heartwood, what is going on so that we can become those agents of positive contagion and ripple out and affect change in a way that is truly in service to our values and wholeness.
Yes. One thing I'm thinking that I want to leave people with or invite them into, as I'm hearing you talking about, this interconnectedness that we've been talking about this whole hour, it feels like kind of heavy, maybe a little overwhelming, this need to be so intersectional, this need to adopt the system thinking, because I'll be so bold as to say everything is interconnected. There could almost be no end.
Yep.
And one of the criticisms of the CMM theory has been that it's too complex. And there's, truth in that. And that's kind of my work of, how do we make it more accessible to people? But also I'd say, well, in order to reflect back a very complex world and speak any kind of truth into a complex world, it has to be very complex.
We cannot flatten.
Yes.
Flattening to me is an instrument of domination.
Yeah.
And the dumbing down of the populace. We are layered individuals living in a layered reality. And the more we flatten and try to make our cognitive dissonance bubbles all happy, the more we are eclipsing ourselves from the reality of the nature of this world.
Yeah. So to me, the question should not be one of how do I simplify this to make it comfy for me?
Yes.
But how do I myself find a comfort in the tension, in a comfort in the discomfort, in the complexity of it all, in the kind of headache of it all? If I'm overwhelmed by looking at this big picture, not how do I make it a smaller picture, but how do I gain the tools and the skill sets and the perspective to be able to engage with this complexity in a really meaningful way.
Yes. And in a heart way. I double click rigor, analytical thinking. Yes, I think as a culture, we need to develop these skills hard, myself included. And we need to engage our heart and our intuition and our dream life and our emotional intelligence, and not just be all head.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Abrah, so well said. So thankful for this conversation with you. As we're wrapping up, is there anything else that you want to leave people with about regeneration or change making or any of it that we've talked about today?
I'll say, if this was overwhelming, that's great. That's an indicator you
Yes.
are moving in the right direction. You're feeling receptive. You're feeling at your edge zone, because we know we can't grow in our comfort zone, and we can't grow in our trauma or panic zone. It's the edge in between where the most evolution happens. We look at the natural world, say a riparian corridor where a river floods into a field. That is the most rich biodiverse place in the whole landscape. And so if this is at your edge and you're also like, well, where do I go from here? There's incredible resources. One concrete place that I know of that's free is we have a free resource library at regeneratechange.com. Lots of beautiful downloads there, including you can download a free chapter of my book. But at the end of my book, I went through an extra geeky kind of research process to create extensive citations and references for each chapter by topic. And so there's incredible thought leaders and frameworks and exercises just all in the back of the book. And we just made it available as a downloadable PDF. So it's really accessible too on our website. So I think dive in, connect with me, connect with some of those thought leaders that are in the back of the book or in your incredible podcast, and follow the thread, whatever is tugging at you that you are hearing on the news or images coming to in your dream life, whatever that thread is for you, tug on it, because I truly believe when we can figure out what the Ikigai says of what are our gifts, our skills, and what the world needs, and we can find the thing at the intersection of those three and follow that thread, we are going to be incredibly fulfilled, happy beings who are having an amazing impact of change on the world.
Wonderful. I think that, such a great next turn of kind of this. We've got learned some new language today, maybe. Now, what kind of action can we take? What can we do with it? So I really, really appreciate your time and your perspective today. Thanks so much, Abrah.
You're so welcome. Great to be with you, Abbie. Thank you.
So great. Okay, that is all for our conversation with Abrah. At the end of each episode, I like to offer some questions to reflect on, which acts as a next turn, so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, the question I would have you think about is what changes when we go beyond sustainability and strive for regeneration instead? I think it's no mystery where this question comes from based on the conversation we've been a part of today. But as this is the last episode for the series, I'd like to take an additional moment here at the end to consider all the episodes of this month together. To me, the work of changing our relationship to the planet, land, nature, the environment, however you want to say it, it is crucial. We cannot talk about creating better social worlds without addressing it, because we can't have better social worlds if there isn't a world to begin with, right? I referenced the hierarchy model in this conversation, and as I reflect on the entire series, I think that is my biggest takeaway from applying a communication perspective to these conversations. Change really does come down to what it is we are prioritizing and what is motivating us. We have the option to choose what the highest level context is that is guiding us. And if this is language that you are not familiar with, I would invite you to check out the short video that I made that's on YouTube about the hierarchy model, or to listen to my episode from season 1 about the hierarchy model. I'll include links to both of those in the show notes, but that's where this language comes from. When we consider what the highest level context is that is guiding us, and recognize that we can change, we can kind of choose, right, what we want to be driven by. And when we are driven by, for example, the desire to live in harmony with nature, when we value well-being over profit, when we move towards ways of relating to land that is not dominating and destructive, it is then that we make the kind of choices and take the kind of action that is not only sustainable, but regenerative. So at the end of this series, I invite you to reflect over all the conversations together, not just what have you learned individually from each one, but together, what can you synthesize and appreciate and take direction from and start to build up that new motivation, that new desire to move towards sustainability and then past sustainability to regeneration. As always, you are welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections as well as any of your own questions or ideas. You can do that through email, the website, and by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. The reason I invite you to share your reflections with me is to stay in dialogue. I say it every time at the top of each episode that dialogue is one of those key factors in what it looks like to take a communication perspective. So outside of you communicating back to me, other ways to stay in dialogue include following the show wherever you listen so you never miss an episode. You can also leave a rating and review, which I very much appreciate, helps get the podcast in front of as many people as possible. And most importantly, for continuing the dialogue, I invite you to share an episode, this episode or another one, or perhaps all of the ones in this series that have been meaningful for you. Take a moment as you do your other reflecting to reflect on who you would want to invite into this dialogue with us. I'm supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution, and this podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations that move us toward better social worlds. No matter who you are or how you came to find this podcast, the CMM Institute has an initiative that is going to be meaningful for you, I believe. One of the biggest right now is that we have a new website, which is www.cosmoactivities.com. And that houses all of our social emotional learning resources created for many different ages. There's Cosmo Kids, tweens, and teens. And we are currently working on Cosmo Parents. So I invite you to go over there and check that out. Whether you are an educator, a parent, anyone who interacts with kids, those are going to be valuable to you. We also have a new home for all of our resources. And this is something I've been working on. So I especially invite you to check it out. And that is the CMM Institute Substack. So you can find us a link I will include in the show notes. And that is where all of our resources exist. So if you're looking to learn more about CMM and a communication perspective for yourself, if you're trying to teach it to others, that's going to be your home for all those resources, including these podcast episodes, as well as infographics and short videos. Again, the links to everything that the CMM Institute does is going to be in the show notes below. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious, and thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.